This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. As our list of New Year's resolutions gets longer and longer, it's our attributes that will determine our ability to see them through. We all strive to perform at our best. Day in and day out, we seek ways to improve ourselves, our teams, our organizations. But how do we define the term best performance? Is it elite? Is it peak? Is it simply human? For our first episode of 2022, I thought we'd start the year with a conversation on first, defining our best, and second, on understanding the core fundamentals that make up our character and our personality, the attributes. Rich Diviney defines our best performance as optimal performance, the best we can do at any specific time based on the environment and the circumstances in and around us. Rich is a former Navy SEAL who revolutionized the way Navy SEALs are assessed and selected for our nation's premier counter-terrorism forces. He's taught leadership and the concept of optimal performance to thousands of businesses and recently launched his new book called The Attributes. Rich joins me to bring in the new year and break down the 25 attributes he believes are critical to assessing ourselves and our people. We define the difference between skills and attributes and character traits. We break down and separate the attributes into logical categories including grit, mental acuity, drive, leadership, team ability, and a special category called the others, in which demonstrating negative tendencies of these attributes may at times actually be a good thing. We also talk about the importance of understanding over judgment, and Rich provides his START process for taking action. 2020 and 2021 tested many of our attributes. We may not have even realized it. We don't know what 2022 will bring, but I know that any success starts with our ability to first understand ourselves. Rich, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
Thanks, Fran. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is our first episode of 2022, so we're going to kick off the new year, and it was super important to me to have this conversation with you. And I know before we started, we were talking about how long it took to actually get in here and do this together. And I said, no, it was intentional. I wanted to start 2022 with you because it's about how do we prepare ourselves in the new year to be mentally and emotionally stronger and better. And we embarked on this journey of the Jedburgh podcast in 2021, where we spoke about elite performance, human performance. How do we improve our individuals, our teams, our organizations? But words matter. I say that all the time, and you say that because I read your book now. And what I'm realizing is how much words matter truly in this definition and this discussion about performance. We're going to get into that. We're going to define performance. We're going to talk about the 25 attributes that you've written about. We're going to talk about optimal performance, the character traits. You said, if you want to understand human performance, yours and others, the first step is to understand the attributes. And that was honestly something that I hadn't thought a whole lot about because we got sucked into kind of this character and the traits. But we ended 2021 talking about physical fitness, physical strength. How do you prepare yourself going into the new year? We kick it off now on emotional and mental strength. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule. We're going to dig in here, and there's a lot to get to.
I'm excited to do it. Let's jump in.
First, we got to define some terms. It's almost a little bit like going down the glossary. Like you go to the back of the book and you say, all right, give me the glossary terms. We'll contextualize this a little bit. But I want to start by defining traits and attributes, because you said attributes should not be confused with personality traits. Quote, a personality is built from patterns of behavior that emerge over an extended period of time. It's an outward expression of all the things that make you, you. Your skills, habits, emotions, perspectives, and yes, attributes all blended together. A multitude of factors influence your personality from genetics to upbringing to environment. Attributes are just one of those elemental ingredients. Can you define traits and attributes and really get into like the difference between the two? Because I don't think everybody truly understands that.
Yeah, it's something I had to really think about while writing. Personality traits and someone's overarching personality can be described as who we are on any given day. And like I said, like you just quoted, I mean, it's a combination of experiences, beliefs that we've developed over time, values, attributes, some of the skills we bring to the table. It's all those things that kind of make up who we are on an everyday basis. But I really am someone who believes, and I think it's maybe because of my background, that there's two versions of us. There's who we are on any given day, kind of in normal days, and then there's who we are when everything goes to hell and you're steeped in challenge and uncertainty and stress. And it's often been said for centuries that the real us shows up during those latter times. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so I'm kind of like, okay, who's the real us? How do we start to dissect and deconstruct who the real us actually is? And that's when I started getting into these elemental attributes. Those attributes are really those qualities that shape our behavior at very elemental, raw levels. I mean, things like patience and adaptability, I mean, those are, we all know, I mean, in the real challenging situations, tough situations, if you are inherently impatient, you're going to be impatient during those situations. If you are inherently patient, you're going to default. You default to these things. And so I was really interested in these defaults. And I think it comes from the whole SEAL background. And I often joke, in SEAL training, you spend, and I'm sure your audience is pretty familiar with SEAL training, but I mean, obviously it's some of the toughest training out there, but you spend hundreds of hours running around with big, heavy boats on your head. You spend hundreds of hours running around with 300-pound telephone poles and exercising with those things and freezing in the surf zone. And I had thought back to my time in the military, and I have done hundreds of combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. Never on one did I carry a boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole on my shoulder, right? So what they were doing to us in SEAL training is actually a misnomer. They weren't really training us in those things and those skills to be a Navy SEAL. They weren't training us at those moments to be shooters or skydivers, or scuba divers. They were putting us into situations and environments so they could tease out these qualities to see if we had what it took, to see who we really were and who we really are, if we had what it took to be Navy SEALs to do the job. And the training came later. So there's a distinction between those skills that they train us to do and those attributes, those raw things that drive our behavior. And I think personality encompasses a lot of that, but largely it can be deficient in describing kind of the raw us.
Well, and what they're trying to test is also, they're trying to identify performance, right? And I want to define performance here and the various elements of performance. I mean, it was the same as a Green Beret, they're going through assessment and selection, and they're putting you in these environments where you're mentally stressed because there's a problem to solve, but then they're adding this physical component. And it's a situation in which almost at times it's designed to fail, because if you fail in it, then it's going to test your resiliency, your adaptability. You're going to stand up and say, yep, okay, I got it. Now, how do we get back on track? Or are you just going to crumble? In the definition of performance, we've thrown already a few out here in this conversation. We've said elite performance, human performance, optimal performance, peak performance. You focus the book and the attributes on optimal performance, the ability to do the best you can in any environment. Can you talk about the difference in these definitions of performance and why optimal performance is the one that you have chosen when you write about and talk about the attributes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, performance really, defined as just the ability to do something, right? That's, a very elemental definition. And I think when we talk about special operations, whether it be Green Berets or SEALs or MARSOC, whatever they are, people outside of those organizations, civilians and otherwise, have this mythology, this mythos around this idea that these guys are top shooters, top scuba divers, top skydivers. They're just these people who go out, they kick doors, they take precision sniper shots, they do cool inserts with parachutes. And in fact, that's not what they are. That's not what we were. I always talked about the fact that we were, in fact, masters of uncertainty. Our job was to be dropped into VUCA environments, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous VUCA environments, and we're able to figure it out. And we figured it out through thinking. Okay, we figure out through thinking, through stress. So performance is, at least in my definition and the definition of the communities that we were involved in, the ability to operate and think through stress and challenge. Now, when we talk about what that looks like, especially during stress and challenge, oftentimes it does not look like peak. And so there's this big thing out in the world right now, it really stems from a lot of the athletic endeavors, whether it be athletic events or races or things like that, where folks are really trying to push themselves physically. They want to be peak performers, this, peak performer, that. But peak, we have to understand, is just an apex. That's what it is. A peak is an apex. An apex, there's only one place to go when you're at the apex, and that's down. Because at an apex, you're at the highest point, which means the only place to go from that point is down. Peak performance has to be usually scheduled, planned, and prioritized, right? The professional football player plans his entire week and conducts his entire week so that he may peak for 3 hours on Sunday, right? That's the job. Spec ops guys don't have that luxury. We have to be prepared to peak on demand. We have to be prepared to do what we need to do. And so the optimal performance says, hey, it's about doing the best you can in the moment, whatever the best looks like in the moment, which means it could look like peak, right? But it also could look like, hey, I'm just head down, nugging it out, going step by step. And it's painful, it's ugly, it's gritty, it's slow. That is also performing optimally. So optimal performance is much, much more descriptive of not only special operations, but life in general.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't need to be peak while I'm driving to the grocery store. I don't.
Like Jeff Gordon driving to the grocery store.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So by defining performance by saying optimal instead of peak, what it allows us to do is two things. First, it allows us to celebrate and reward ourselves for both polarities. Certainly, great, that was cool. It was flow states. Everything was clicking. But also those times when we are just nugging it out and it's going step by step and it's tough and it's painful and it's gritty. Pat ourselves on the back because we're performing optimally, right? The other thing it allows us to do, which is really important, is it allows us to modulate our energy in very responsible, healthy ways, okay? Again, I don't need to be peak driving the grocery store. I can be off the gas. I can be recovering. I don't know if you've had you had these experiences, but I know there were several times where I'd be in a helicopter flying into a combat zone, okay, with my guys, getting ready to be dropped and inserted into a combat zone. And the guys around me were asleep or napping, or looking or listening to music. Okay. People think, civilians, because of, the mythology, think that we're like, hoo-yah, high five, and let's do this, right? No, we don't do that because it's wasting too much energy. We all understood inherently that we needed to preserve ourselves because we don't know how long it's going to be. We don't know how long we're going to have to be out there. We don't know when we're going to have to peak, when we'll get to rest. We're always modulating our energy so that we can perform optimally. When I'm riding in a helicopter on the way into a mission, I don't need to be performing at my peak. I should be resting. I should be conserving, and so we begin to generate habits around how to modulate our energy at the perfect moment, perfect time, perfect level so that we can peak on demand. We can recover when necessary.
In the Army, they called it smoke 'em if you got 'em. That's what they would say. That applied to any, if you could sleep, sleep. If you could eat, eat. Let's talk about skills versus attributes. You said skills are learned, attributes we're born with. How do you differentiate the two, skills versus attributes?
Yeah, there's a few distinctions. So skills are not inherent to our nature. Okay, none of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or drive a car, or in the military case, shoot a gun. We're trained to do those things. We're taught to do those things. Skills direct our behavior in known situations. Okay, here's how and when to ride a bike. Here's how and when to drive a car or shoot a gun. And then because they're visible and they're didactic, they're very easy to see, measure, and assess. Okay, you can put scores around them. You can put stats around them. You can see how well anybody does any skill. In the business sense, you could put them on a resume. Okay, and people, okay, they're very visible, i.e., very seductive, especially when you're putting together a team or you're trying to assess performance. It's why people usually default to skills when they think about top performers. They think
you
about
get sucked
skills.
in. You're like, they have all these skills and these certifications. Hire them immediately.
Yeah, totally. But what they don't tell us is all the intangibles, all the peripheries. They don't tell us how we're going to operate in uncertainty, challenge, and stress, how we're going to think through situations. This is when we lean on our attributes. Attributes are more elemental. They're inherent. Okay, we're all born with levels of adaptability, patience, discipline, situational awareness. Okay, now you can certainly develop them over time and experience. Okay, but you can see levels of this stuff in small children, so they're already there to begin with. They also don't direct our behavior. They inform our behavior. My son's levels of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. Okay, so they inform how we're going to show up. And then because they're hidden in the background, they're hard to see and therefore hard to measure and assess. Okay, you see them the most visibly and viscerally during times of challenge, uncertainty, and stress when skills can't be applied. This is why the training you and I went through is so powerful, because nothing about that had to do with applying skills to anything. It was just throw them in these situations, see what happens, right? But really, talent overall is not skills based. It's actually a dynamic dance between skills and attributes. Listen, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, listen to these, and sports is one of these environments where they're very skills heavy, okay? Because it's conditioned, it's rules based, it's kind of certain in many ways. So it's very skills heavy. But what makes up a Drew Brees, what makes up a Tom Brady is not because they're only skilled, okay? There are people out there who can throw the football just as far as Tom Brady can throw the football or Drew Brees can throw the football. What makes them who they are is because they have attributes that are also attached. They know they have the situational awareness to read things. They have the patience to look. They have the discipline. They have mental acuity. All these attributes start to come to the fore. So the best talent out there is actually a dance and a synchronization between skills and attributes. But ultimately, if we want to measure performance, if we want to build high-performing teams that actually operate, not only when things are going great, but also when things are going really bad, we have to look at attributes, not just skills.
I want to talk about you for a second before we dig into the attributes, because I'll say this and you'll laugh. I know you will. And I'll say, you weren't just a Navy SEAL. And I joke with the Navy SEALs all the time because every Navy SEAL, everyone knows who they are because what's the joke, right? They told you they were a Navy SEAL versus the Green Berets who sit here and, we're quiet. We're in the background. The motto is the quiet professionals. But in all seriousness, you ran assessment and selection for one of our nation's most elite units. And this is an organization that, without being apocryphal about it, really, it comes to you to set the conditions for our nation's national security, because the focus always gets put on the operator who's out there on the front line, the guy making the news, the guy who shot bin Laden, right? But somebody had to assess him. Somebody had to select him. Somebody had to say, this person demonstrates the attributes, the character, everything we're looking for in a person who one day might be in a situation where they're going to have to decide that I'm going to shoot Osama bin Laden or not, right? And that is where the greatness of our country, the greatness of an organization is made, is in the person who has to actually make that choice about someone else. And so much credit to you for filling that role and doing such a phenomenal job for so many years as you were there. But this is not an easy job. You said that evaluation is not necessarily about selecting people who know how to do the job, but those who could do the job. Can you make the distinction between how and could? Because I think this applies to any organization, not just the military. As you're building teams in the private sector, your company, small business, large business, it's the same. It's the same evaluation criteria.
Yeah, totally. To put it as simply as possible, how is the skills and could is the attributes, right? I mean, how to, these are the things I need to know to do this job, whether it's be shooting a gun in the SEAL case, whether it's typing, whether it's selling something. The how to are the skills that are required to do that. The could are those attributes that allow you to operate in that environment. Okay. Again, give the Tom Brady and Drew Brees. There are people out there who know how to throw a ball just as well as Drew Brees and Tom Brady. Okay. Could they, however, stand in a lineup there on a Super Bowl during a Super Bowl with 350-pound linebackers sprinting at full speed towards them, have the wherewithal to think through what they're seeing and get the ball precisionally placed at a target to execute, right? That is the could. That takes attributes. And so what we discovered in the training that I was running was that, again, we were at this particular command, we were taking some of the highest ranked and highest skilled SEALs to come to our organization and then put them through our selection process. So these are kind of
they're already SEALs. That's the thing. Like they're already at the top.
Yeah, the minimum time requirements. You had to be you had to have been an active SEAL for at least 5 to 6 years before you could even apply. Right? I know I was at the 9-year mark when I actually applied. Okay, so these are experienced guys. Most of them already been through combat, right? So they're coming now to us to go through our selection. And we're getting a 50% attrition rate. Now, that's okay because any assessment selection is designed to attrite. That's why you have it. Okay, what wasn't okay is we didn't know how to effectively articulate why guys at these top levels were making it and why guys weren't making it. And one of the question periods that really hit me was when I was actually going through the training. When I was going through the selection and assessment myself to be a part of that command, I remember I was going through with several of my friends, one friend in particular, another officer, one of my best friends as an officer, and in my opinion, one of the best officers in the Navy, let alone just the SEAL teams. This guy was, and still is, because I think he's still in, phenomenal officer, just hands down, phenomenal officer. And I remember he did not make it, okay, and I did. And I said to myself, how the heck am I still here and this guy's not? It had to be more than just what we're seeing. It had to be more. So fast forward a few years after I'd served in the command and then was asked to run the assessment and training, no one could effectively articulate still what was going on. So I set about to try to figure it out. And that's when I started to say, wait a second, this is not about those things we see. This is about those things that we're not seeing. They're on the periphery, these attributes. And what we need to do is start to look at and ask ourselves, what are the specific attributes we're looking for in people to come to this organization? What does that list look like? And then once we have that list, we can start looking at our training and saying, okay, now I see why this person's making, because this person has this attribute. Both people that I'm seeing, the guy who didn't make it and the guy who could, it's not that they weren't skilled. Both of them could shoot, but one had the attributes to be able to shoot inside of an environment that we needed him to, and the other didn't necessarily have that, right? So it allowed us to really articulate the process in a much more precise way and have much more healthy conversations with those folks that we deselected, as well as the leadership who wanted explanations as to why.
See, I find that so interesting because I think back to when I went to selection for special forces, and Ranger School was the same thing at the end of Ranger School. And I remember standing there kind of in the formation, and you look around and you're like, oh, okay, which formation am I in, right? Am I in the one that made it, or I'm in the one at 9? You're looking around, and I remember the same conclusion coming to my head, because you don't, as a candidate, you don't know, right? You don't know anything. You don't know what they're looking for. It's very much, do your best. Maybe your best is good enough. Maybe it's not. But I remember looking around after you realize that, okay, I made it, and looking at the other formation and saying, well, everybody who's standing in my formation, everybody deserved to be here, is how I felt in both of those situations. And I looked at the other formation and I said, wow, there might be some guys in there, though, who I don't understand why they're not here, right? And I remember having that conversation. Everyone who made it should have, but there were people who didn't, who I was like, oh, man, why?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that question, that why, is, I think, what I began to try to answer with the attributes. Because the answer to that why is because they didn't have those specific qualities to do the particular job we're asking them to do. Not that they're not good people, not that they're not highly qualified. It's just every job, every niche has its own unique set of attributes required to fill that niche, right? The list of attributes required to be a Navy SEAL looks different than the list of attributes required to be a surgeon or a teacher or an athlete or you name the profession.
Even a Green Beret.
Even a Green Beret. Those are slightly different too. Yeah, absolutely. And so those unique lists becomes a guidepost as to why and how you can figure out if the people who are applying or going through can do the job, right? Versus know how to do the job. And I think this stems from, the origins of the Navy SEALs are the underwater demolition teams, and previous to them, the naval combat demolition units formed up, asked to be created by this guy named Draper Coffin. Draper Coffin was tapped to create a unit that could swim ashore enemy beaches and find obstacles and blow obstacles out of the way and get the beach ready for an amphibious landing.
Easy day,
but born from the travesty, that utter failure of Gallipoli, the Gallipoli campaign in World War I. In World War II, military planners, Allied planners, did not want to make the same mistake. So they tapped this guy, Draper Coffin, who had previously run an EOD school, an Explosives Ordnance Disposal School. So he had run a school previously. He knew a ton of dudes who knew exactly how to blow things up, had every single skill that was required to blow something up in terms of their knowledge of explosives and demolitions. But Coffin also knew, he said, this job is different. It's not going to be just blowing things up. I need guys who can actually swim ashore. They can sometimes go ashore if they need to. They can think on their feet. They can adapt. They can react. They'll be on their own. So they need to basically do stuff just in swim pairs. All they'll have on them is explosives and a dive knife and some swim fins. That's it. And no shirt, right? Just a UDT short. So I need guys who know how to...
Which is a tradition that's permeated into the SEALs, even today.
Yes, yeah. I need people who can really adapt and think and operate in this very, very complex, ambiguous, uncertain environment, this very VUCA environment. The skills are okay, but I can teach someone how to blow something up. So he basically started down at Fort Pierce and decided he'd start his training with the toughest week imaginable. He basically would start the guys off on a Sunday afternoon and run them ragged until Friday, giving them only a couple hours sleep the whole week, and running them through combat simulations and exercises and PTs. The interesting thing is he was not going to give them any tests. He was not going to give anybody any evaluations. He was not going to give anybody any scores. The only thing that would cause a candidate to leave training would be that candidate's decision to leave, right? It was all placed on that candidate, quit or stay. Well, 90% quit, so he had 10, but he knew that 10% he had left. He's like, these are the people who I know have what it takes. They can do the job. Now I'll quickly teach them how to do the job, but they can do the job. That week, of course, it was nicknamed Hell Week. It's still to this day the 5th week of SEAL training, not the first, but it's the 5th week. Every single Navy SEAL goes through Hell Week, and that is still the crucible inside of which they choose Navy SEAls. But the idea was He was looking for attributes. He wasn't just looking for skill.
Yeah, and it's the special operations force's truth that quality is better than quantity. All right, well, let's get into the attributes. There's 25 that you referenced. Well, there's 28, but it kind of is 25 and 3, and we'll kind of talk about a bit of them here. You said there could be 30, there could be 40, but you've grouped these 25 specifically into 5 categories: grit, mental acuity, drive, leadership, team ability. I want to frame the next portion of this conversation kind of around those 5 core categories. First, why 25? Why not 50? Why not 40, 30? I mean, the book could have been 500 pages.
It could have, yeah. And again, it is 25 total. It's about 22 in those 5 categories and then 3 extras, which I know we'll talk about. But it seemed to me when I looked at I basically pulled out all the stuff I had been doing while I was in the SEAL teams in the SEALs team, when we came up with the attributes, we came up with 36 attributes that we were looking for in the SEAL guys. And I said, okay, let me take these 36 and see if I can ubiquitize this to some degree, because I don't want it to be about SEALs, right? I want it to be about optimal performance. And so when I really dove in from that optimal performance angle, that 25 seemed to line up nicely for optimal performance. There are more attributes. They're not just 25, but these seem to line up for optimal performance and they seem to be able to cross context. In other words, be relatable to most every human being who's interested in optimal performance, not just Navy SEALs.
So the first category is grit. And you said optimal performers need grit. Grit is not a singular trait. It's about carrying on and pushing through, sometimes only in tiny increments, no matter how difficult or miserable the challenge. You referenced Hell Week, which I have not been to Hell Week, but I can imagine and have spoken to many of you who have. And I'm glad I was a Green Beret, let's put it that way. But grit consists of 4 component attributes: courage, perseverance, adaptability, and resilience. Can you get into grit a little bit more? Why does it matter? And how come these 4 specifically for grit?
I love grit as a category. And by the way, when I think I didn't have the categories in mind when I started writing the book. The categories started to formulate as I wrote the book, which was really nice because they started to clump kind of fairly naturally into these categories. But grit, a lot of people think of grit.
It helped me frame this podcast, by the way. So I do appreciate that.
That's what I did. So.
I spent a lot of time thinking about how am I going to get through 25 of these things? And then I started reading the book. I'm like, oh my God, he put them in 5.
Well,
Here we go.
My editor was happy that we added some categories too, because he was like, this is a lot, Rich. So anyway, it all worked out nicely. Grit is interesting because a lot of people think of grit as its own attribute. They think of it as a singular thing. And it's not. Grit is actually the result of things kind of catalyzed and blended together to create grit. And in the attribute case, it's these 4 attributes. And it made sense to me because as you look at grit, and grit really can be described as the ability to push through and achieve kind of those acute challenges and goals, right? Those things that are more short term in terms of goals and endeavors, right? Power through, push through. That grit kind of describes that versus drive, which I know we'll talk about, which really speaks to the long term goals and endeavor. But those attributes required for grit are quite specific. First, there's courage, the ability to step into our fear. All right, quite simply, we have to be able to step into our fear to do that. Perseverance, you have to be able to keep doing it. So the courage to step in, the perseverance to keep going, the adaptability to basically change and modulate yourself based on an environment outside your control. Okay. And then resilience, that all takes energy. It's going to take a challenge. You're going to take hits. How effectively can we bounce back from that stuff? And so those attributes kind of combined and stewed together, catalyzed, are what in fact create the gritty person.
Can I ask you about perseverance? Because perseverance you've defined as being a combination of 3 other things: persistence, tenacity, and fortitude. Can you break that down a little bit more?
I love this one because I really had to get into it, because persistence and tenacity, which were both original attributes on the list, I realized were inherently different because those things get conflated, and left on their own could be either detrimental or inert. And the reason is because persistence is the ability to, when faced with a challenge or a goal, to keep doing the same thing over and over, because you know that eventually it'll work, right? This is the stonecutter approach. The stonecutter basically taps the rock in the same place 99 times and you don't see anything. On the 100th tap, the rock breaks, right? So that's persistence. Tenacity is the opposite. And so persistence takes patience, okay? Tenacity is the opposite. Tenacity is I'm going to try something. If it doesn't work, I'm going to try something else, okay? And I'm going to keep changing my approach until what I need to happen happens. That actually takes impatience, okay? And then fortitude is the ability to, mental fortitude specific, is the ability to modulate between the two, because one is not going to just work. It's not going to, you're not going to get across the finish line by using just one. Almost every challenge and every obstacle takes an ability to modulate between persistence at times and tenacity at other times. And so that's why perseverance combined both. And the effective perseverance will be a combination of those three things in whatever percentages make sense, because every challenge will require different percentages of each. But certainly all three are involved.
You have successfully described the Jedburgh podcast over the last year. The second category is mental acuity. And you've said that it's a measure of how sharp the mind is, but it has little to do with education or even raw intelligence. Can you get a little bit more into this? There's 4 in here: situational awareness, compartmentalization, task switching, and learnability. But these 4 I found very intriguing because you're very clear that you cannot have mental acuity unless these 4 work together.
These are the 4, whereas the categories are helpful because I was able to clump these attributes in them. They are not exclusive to each category, right? They cross over. I mean, certainly when you talk about drive, courage can be involved in drive as well, and so on and so forth. Mental acuity is the one that all of these are actually interrelated because it has to do with how our mind processes the world, right? So you can't really have one going without the other. So starting with situational awareness is this idea of how much information we're actually perceiving in our environment, in our world, right? It's our level of vigilance, really, to be quite blunt. Some people are more situational aware than others. Some people notice a lot of things. I'm quite high on situational awareness. I notice things when I walk around. I'm very attentive. I'm vigilant. In some cases, I have hypervigilance, which a lot of us coming back from combat have, and that can be bad as well. Too much stuff coming in. We don't know how to turn things off. We're noticing too much. But anyway, people fall differently on the scale. So once we get that stuff in, once we notice stuff, then there's compartmentalization. That's basically from the information that we are noticing in the context of the goal we're currently trying to achieve, we assess the information that's relevant, prioritize the order it needs to be put in, and then focus on the priorities, right? That's compartmentalization in a nutshell. What do I need to focus on in this moment that's the highest priority in the conduct of this goal? Those who are higher on the ability to compartmentalize do this very rapidly, and I would place most special operators in that category. That's one of our skills. One of our skills is the ability to execute this attribute, right? But that's how we basically move through challenge, stress, and uncertainty so fluidly, is through compartmentalization. Then there's task switching. Task switching is our ability to shift focus points. Okay, again, multitasking is a myth. Okay, we can't focus really on more than one thing at a time. Neuroscientists will say you can maintain what's called like a secondary focus to some extent, but most of us, just in layman's terms, we can't focus on more than one thing at a time. And the example...
But we all think we're good at it.
We all think we're good at it, right? Someone might be listening and say, what are you talking about? I'm listening to this podcast while I'm driving the car right now. Okay, I'm doing 2 things at once. But the problem
and you're in the breakdown lane.
The problem is you are doing that, but the problem is it doesn't count if you've relegated that activity to your unconscious mind. The reason why you're able to listen to this podcast and drive a car is because you don't have to think about driving the car right now. Now, if someone swerves in front of you, though, and you have to conduct evasive maneuvers to get out of the way, you will have to rewind the last 15 seconds of this podcast because your focus will just have switched. Okay, so our task switching is our ability to hop between contexts and categories in our environment and switch focus points. And the more effectively and efficiently we're able to do that, the higher on task switching we are. Party planners typically are high task switchers, right? Because they can go into a party and like focus on the drinks and then switch focus to the music and then switch focus to the get. I mean, they're just designed to, they think they're multitasking, but they're not. They're actually able to just task switch very efficiently. And then some other people just have a really hard time switching focus that fast. Okay, now, again, there's no judgment here. It's just where you land. And then learnability is our ability to kind of metabolize and process these lessons in a way that we can affect our behavior and our environment. We can learn the lessons, all right? Some are higher on learnability, some are lower. Those people who are really, really high on learnability are the people you can tell something one time and they got it, right? Versus me, who's low on learnability, and like I have to be told a few times and I make a bunch of mistakes trying to learn it, right? I have to repeat, right? So I'm a little lower on learnability. But again, I know that about myself. And so even when I was in certain SEAL aspects of SEAL training, I would just practice longer. I'd study harder, right? Because I just knew I just had to repeat it or else I wasn't going to remember. Whereas some of my buddies they'd learn it one time and they'd go drinking and they were fine, So it's just wherever you end up on the scale.
My wife will put me at 0 on the learnability and say
you've learned how to do this podcast. You're not 0. You may be 1, but if you're 0, you wouldn't survive. So
that's where we bring up perspective. Perspective matters. Right. You brought up drive a few minutes ago. Drive is just this push to get it done. But in the conversation about drive, you brought up a concept of intrinsic versus extrinsic needs. And there's a few things in drive here that I really want to kind of dig into. I found this fascinating. But can you discuss the difference between intrinsic versus extrinsic, and also maybe just define drive before we hop into that?
Intrinsic and extrinsic motivations come from Dan Pink's book on drive, which he called Drive. It's actually great stuff where he talks about the difference between those internal motivations versus the external pressures. Okay, an internal and intrinsic motivation is I'm hungry or I'm thirsty. Okay, that's internal to you, but external motivation or extrinsic motivation could be the bonus that I want to get at the end of the quarter or something like that, something external. So, and what he talks about in terms of drive, true drive, it is a lot more. There's a lot more value just systemically in our biology placed on those intrinsic motivations. We'll do more for intrinsic than we will for extrinsic. But in terms of drive holistically, unlike grit, now we're talking about the ability to set, pursue, and achieve long-term goals. What are those things that make up the driven person when it comes to these long-term goals? And those attributes are self-efficacy, discipline, open-mindedness, cunning, and narcissism. Those 5 things make up the driven person and speak to how driven we are and add or subtract to it. You can have 1 or 2 of those attributes. You can be high on 1 or 2 of those, but if it's just 1 or 2, you're probably not driven. Okay, you need actually usually 3 or more for those to combine into the driven person.
But cunning and narcissism are often perceived as negative.
They are. Yeah, they are. But you know as well as you, let's say cunning first. I mean, probably the most common attribute of special operators, whether it be Green Beret or Navy SEALs, is cunning. Cunning is the ability to think outside the box, to think outside perceived rules, boundaries, and constraints. The cunning mind looks at a problem. And so cunning has to do with problem. There's a problem-solving element to cunning. I have to solve this problem. And the cunning mind, what the cunning mind does when given a problem is the first question the cunning mind asks is, okay, what are the rules that are around this thing? And are they real or are they perceived? And if they're perceived, then I don't need to follow them. If they are real, what happens if I break them? And that's what the cunning mind seeks to look. This is exactly how transformational thinking happens. So how do we start thinking outside the box and thinking about different ways? So the cunning mind is primed to do that. And it's a very common quality of special operators. Now, of course, it can be metabolized negatively, and that's why we have to be careful. But when metabolized properly, it's very, very powerful and very, very essential in the driven person. And then narcissism. Narcissism is definitely pejorative, right? Because we had the narcissistic personality disorder is not a good thing, and narcissism is not seen as a good thing. But narcissism, at its core, again, I'm really into semantics, and I really like to think about words in their kind of elemental definitions. Narcissism, at its elemental definition, is the desire to stand out and be recognized and be adored. That's what it is. When we are infants and we are getting adored and paid attention to by our parents or anybody, right? We are actually getting bursts of 3 very powerful chemicals. We're getting dopamine, we're getting serotonin, and we're getting oxytocin while we're getting paid attention to and adored. That doesn't change when we're adults. We like to be paid attention to once in a while. So the idea is every single human being at some point in their lives wants to be paid attention to. They want to be adored. They want to be made to feel special. It's a human thing. So we all have elements of narcissism, and these elements of narcissism are, in fact, often the impetus to audacious goals. I mean, why the heck did you become a Green Beret? Why did I become a Navy SEAL? Anybody who you ask that question, they say, because I'm a patriot, they're lying to you. Okay, well, I wouldn't say they're lying. They're just not telling you the full truth. We wanted to do it because we wanted to be badasses. We wanted to see if we could do something that very few people could do, right? Now, yeah, of course we're patriots, right? But ultimately there's some narcissistic tendencies there. It's same thing with people who want to be great surgeons or great salespeople, whatever the audacious goal is. There's a hint of narcissism. So narcissism, when metabolized in a healthy way, can really be very, very powerful drivers in our being and our physiology. The warning label comes with the fact that if it tips above the scales, it's dangerous. And it's like a vampire staring in the mirror. We can't see it in ourselves, even if we're tipping over the scales. The way we tell is we look at who we're surrounding ourselves with. The true blue, unhealthy narcissist surrounds themselves with sycophants, with people who put them at the center, who bow and submit to them. It's a very transient group, okay? And when someone leaves the group of a narcissist, that person is immediately enemy number 1, okay? That narcissist immediately lashes out because suddenly that person's an enemy. So we can basically manage our own narcissism by looking at the people we surround ourselves with. If we surround ourselves with people who are yes men, who put us at the center of attention all the time, it's likely we're a little bit over-indexed, or if not a lot over-indexed on narcissism. On the other hand, and this is where the teams like Green Berets or SEAL teams come in, if you surround yourself with people who keep you in check, tell you,
they'll tell you. They're the first ones to tell you when you're messed up.
Or like my wife has been this for me, then you can actually metabolize narcissism in a very healthy way because you've surrounded yourself with people who don't always put you at the center and tell you the truth when you need to hear it. So that's the way to keep it in check.
Discipline is another one here in Drive that I think is important to highlight because there's a difference between self-discipline versus discipline. And you said that self-discipline is an internal skill versus discipline is an external attribute. Can you make that distinction?
Yes. Self-discipline involves those goals or endeavors that we set out upon that the external world has no control as to whether or not we accomplish it. Okay. So that would be like you and I say, I want to eat healthier or I want to get in shape. Okay. I could decide right now to eat healthier. And then I could go to Vegas tomorrow and I could be at a buffet. Okay. The buffet is not going to throw pastries at me. Okay. It's up to me as to whether or not I eat healthy.
You might feel like it.
You might feel like it, but it's not. It's me. So self-discipline involves those things that the external world has no say in, whether or not you achieve. Discipline involves those things that the external world does have a say in, whether or not you achieve. Okay, this is writing the best-selling book. This is becoming a Green Beret or Navy SEAL. This is becoming a surgeon. Whatever those goals are, the external world has a say as to whether or not you're going to do that, whether you're going to accomplish that. The reason why self-discipline can be sometimes put into a skills, and it's I think it's an attribute that takes certain skills, right? And so I would actually define it more as an attribute than a skill, both self-discipline and discipline. But self-discipline, the highly self-disciplined person tends to really like routine and structure because routine and structure are often very helpful when trying to conduct self-disciplined tasks. And you can this is the person who eats healthy, like eats the right stuff every day, works out every day at the right time, goes to bed. It's very, very structured, okay? The problem is, and because I know we've all experienced people who are very highly self-disciplined, but they can't get their life on track at all because they have no overall discipline, okay? They can't seem to accomplish those long-term goals. The reason is because those people sometimes who skew to the very, very high right of self-discipline, i.e. very, very self-disciplined, because they like routine and structure so much, they don't recognize that discipline, the achievement of goals that the external world has to say, is going to knock you on your ass, okay? The world is going to not let you keep a routine. The world is going to throw curveballs at you. So the disciplined person, the person who's really good at these long-term goals is usually very fluid, very adaptable, very flexible, okay? So the best combo is to have a nice medium of both, right? Those who skew to either side might have issues. I'm someone who skews to the side of discipline. I'm actually really good at setting and achieving audacious goals, but it's also because I'm very adaptable and very fluid. I have a horrible time with self-discipline, okay, because I hate routine, right? I hate structure. I hate being told what to do, even when I'm telling myself what to do. I hate it, right? So you have to just see where you are.
I don't have to do that.
Yeah, you don't have to listen to me. What are you talking about, right? So don't tell me what to do. Me. So yeah, wherever the best is a balance. If you skew to either side, you can probably tell and you can maybe hopefully index. For me, to try to be more self-disciplined, I just have to implement structure and routine a little bit better. Try to create habits that don't necessarily feel like I'm dictating to myself.
I always feel self-disciplined until about 6:30 in the morning when my 2-year-old and my 12-year-old get up. And then I realize that it really doesn't matter what my self-discipline is. It's out the window, at least for the next few hours.
Yeah. Well, and that's why if you have both, and if you're able to have both, and a lot of people do, and really a lot of highly successful people are able to do both very nicely, that means you have a routine, but you can get thrown off your routine. And then once you do, you get back on routine, right? That's the balance of those happening. Problem with a guy like me is I get thrown off my routine and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm comfortable here. And I never get back, right? So
give me that pastry. Yeah. I got to get back on this thing.
The person who's very highly disciplined, they just avoid things that throw them off routine, right? And that's why they can't really find themselves out trying to do some of those audacious things that take discipline.
Leadership is the fourth category. Leadership is probably the largest component of Navy SEAL organization, Green Beret organization, private sector organization. Doesn't matter what you do. If you're an athlete, you're in business, you're in the military, you're in anything, it's all about leadership. And, there's even, I would say you can lead yourself at times, like we were just talking about, what do you want that to look like? But you said leadership's not a position, it's behavior, and you can't declare yourself to be a leader. We have so many conversations about the definition of leadership. And I wanted to ask you, what's your definition of leadership before we break down the attributes?
The confusing thing about leadership is that we often think of leadership as a noun, the person in front, the person on top. And in fact, true leadership is a verb. It's a behavior. So my definition skews both ways, right? If the noun leader, the noun version of leadership is the person who's in front, the leader of the race, right? The leader of the pack, the person in front. So that's by definition the leader. But if you want to lead people, you don't get to do that. You don't get to tell people, hey, follow me. No, people make a decision whether or not they're going to look at you as a leader. Now, you can be in charge, right? There's a difference between being in charge and being a leader, okay? And anybody can self-designate. I'm the person in charge, right? Or someone can be put in the military. Once you hit a certain rank and put in a certain position, you are now in charge. Whether or not people choose to follow you, people choose to look at you as a leader is entirely up to how you behave. And you and I know this. In fact, anybody listening probably knows this. There are people in our lives who we can think of in this moment who are in positions of power. They're in charge, and we wouldn't follow that person out of the neighborhood, let alone anywhere else, right? And then there are other people who have no authority whatsoever, who maybe are by the water cooler or behind a counter, and we would follow that person to the gates of hell and back, right? And it's because of the way that person behaves. That's why we choose that person. So leadership, ultimately, when it comes to people, is about how you behave, and those behaviors stem from attributes. And those attributes are empathy, selflessness, authenticity, decisiveness, and accountability. Those behaviors that typically, when conducted, allow someone to say, you know what, this is someone that I choose as a leader. This is someone I want to follow.
Can you break down empathy? You mentioned the 5 that make it up here, but empathy is not sympathy. And can you make that distinction?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to kind of describe it in Brene Brown terms is sympathy is I know how you feel. Empathy is I feel how you feel. Okay, empathy is literally the process of engaging someone else's emotions to the extent that you can say, you know what, I feel how you are feeling. Okay, that is really powerful, and and when you do that for another human being, they immediately feel like they're cared for. They feel compassion and care from you, which is a perfect way to start endearing you as a leader to them. They will start feeling that way. So that's what true empathy is.
The other one in here is decisiveness. I think people oftentimes, they think about the military, they think about C-level executives who they can often be extremely successful in their rise to the top. And they think that it's somebody who just sits there and dictates. Decisive means dictatorial. That's not really the case, though. And I think you've defined decisiveness in a great way here in terms of that decision making. Decision making is a skill, but decisiveness is an attribute. Can you dig further into that?
The key factor that is added onto the decision-making process that causes decisiveness is speed and efficiency. The decision-making process is a skill, and you can be trained and taught how to make better decisions by going through a process. The speed and efficiency with which you are able to do that is an attribute. Some people are just able to do that faster. They process information faster, and they're able to kind of make a decision faster, especially during times of challenge and stress and uncertainty, because again, most decisions are going to involve some level of uncertainty. And that comfort with a little bit of uncertainty and that ability to say, hey, we're moving on this is what enables decisiveness, right? As long as it's responsibly done. And again, it has to be kind of noted that the decisive person understands also that a decision can be final, but not permanent, okay? When you make a decision, that's final. In fact, decision, that the Latin, the root word means to cut off other possibilities. When you decide something, you cut off other possibilities, right? So you decide, you cut off other possibilities, you move on that decision. You're making a final decision. But if it's buttressed by accountability, okay, then you know that once we're moving, we're now re-gauging. We're saying, okay, was this the right decision? How are things going? And it might not be permanent. You might now say, okay, that was the wrong decision. We're changing our path because of what we've just now experienced. But to be decisive means I'm going to make a decision in a rapid, efficient manner. We're going to move on it. And then through accountability, we're going to constantly reassess and see if it was the right decision. Do I need to change? And that's a constant process. And those who can do that well, people generally like to follow.
The last category is team ability. You cited the importance of collaboration, connection, trust, but another one of those like leadership where you don't get to decide if you're a team person or not, if you're a team player. I think this one's really interesting having this conversation with you as a SEAL and with my background in the Army Special Forces, but because actually in the Army Special Forces, team ability is not towards the top. In the SEALs, my understanding is it is much further towards the top. Can you talk more about team ability and why integrity, conscientiousness, humility, and humor make up team ability?
Yeah, I'm glad first of all, it's amazing you brought up that distinction because it's one I've actually thought about and actually talked about when I was running SEAL training. You're right. Special Forces and a couple of the other Army units, not necessarily Rangers, but a couple of the elite units, team ability is not as far at the top, whereas with SEAL team, it is. And that's because I think the job of a Green Beret sometimes requires an ability to operate individually in a situation and environment. Okay. You need to be able to say, I'm out on my own. I can do this. I got this, right? There's nothing about SEAL training that encourages individual performance. And I say that it sounds bad, but it's really meant in the context of you always have your swim buddy with you. And it comes from this idea that when you're underwater, you have another person with you at all times. And so it's skewed to this ability to work with others. And team ability, I don't know who made up that word. I first heard it at the SEAL teams, or at Native Special Warfare.
Sounds good. Let's use it.
Yeah. So anyway, but it's this ability to work with others on a team. Okay. And those attributes, again, you don't get to call yourself a great teammate. Other people decide that. And they decide that based on behavior. And those behaviors stem from these attributes: integrity, conscientiousness, humility, and humor. Those four things behaved are typically what causes people to say that is a good teammate.
You referred to the first 22 as being on a dimmer switch, and that dimmer switch at the bottom end is 0. But now there's 3 others that also have a negative sliding scale that can lead to potentially detrimental behavior. You call it a seesaw: patience, competitiveness, fear of rejection. Why are these 3, patience, competitiveness, fear of rejection, different than the first 22?
Yeah, well, the first 22, like you said, are kind of on a dimmer switch. Now, the dimmer switch does not go to 0, because I would say we all have all of the attributes at some level, even if it's a 1. No one has 0 adaptability. No one has 0 resilience, right? We all have some, right? But we could have a little lower. And typically on the first 22, edging out towards the higher, the mid-range, the 7s and 8s, that's better, right? So the higher you get is better on those first 22. And again, too high is also bad, but that's the idea for the first 22. What I found when I was working with those other 3 was that when I looked at the polarities of each of them, I didn't see the same trends, right? So in other words, there are very highly successful people who are very patient. They're high on patience. There are also very highly successful people who are high on impatience, okay? There are highly successful people who are very competitive. There are also highly successful people who are non-competitive at all. They're not competitive at all. And same with this idea of fear of rejection. I care what people think, versus people who don't care what people think at all. They just do their own thing. And so when I looked at those, I realized those were in the others category, because you can be on either side of those and still perform very optimally. It's just knowing what side you're on tends to explain your behavior a little bit more accurately.
Are there really people who don't care what others think? Because I feel like people say that all the time, and I don't know if it's a defense mechanism where people are like, I don't care what that person thinks, whatever. Whereas actually maybe you do. I mean, are there really a subset of people who genuinely don't care what others think and they just do what they want?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're social animals, so ultimately, I guess all of us to some extent. But my son is one of these people. I mean, I have 2 sons. My eldest is like me. My youngest is like my wife. I am someone who has typically cared what people think, okay? And that can be detrimental because it can lead to peer pressure and things like that. But it also be very powerful because it can push you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't do. But you ask any Navy SEAL, hey, what was, during surf torture, why didn't you quit SEAL training, okay? A lot of the answers you might get sounds something like, I didn't want to be the guy who stood up and rang that bell, because you have to ring the bell to quit SEAL training. I didn't want to be that one guy who stood up. There's a palpable sense of, hey, I don't want to look bad. So I will stay in this damn surf zone and freeze until I die before I'm the one who has to stand up and look bad. Okay, that is...
You got to drag me out.
Yeah, that is an element, a pretty strong element of caring what other people think. Okay, it's also why a guy like me who hates heights still does thousands of skydives with my teammates, because I'm going to jump out of the plane whether I like it or not, because my teammates are jumping out of the plane and there's no way I'm going to look bad, right? I'm just going to do it. Even the guys who don't like scuba diving, same thing. So a fear of rejection can be very powerful, but there's also those people who literally don't care, right? My youngest son, who's like my wife, he doesn't care what people think. He is his own person. There's a superpower that I see in him, and I see in my wife too, where they just do their own thing. They're their own person. They do their own thing. They make their own joke, whatever it is. And people flock to them, okay? Because they see they're like beacons, right? And people are like, ooh, look what this person's doing. But this is where iconoclasts sit, right? A lot of iconoclasts are people who didn't care what anybody thought. And they really just did their thing because they didn't care, right? And so there's a power there. And I think the interesting thing is that the interesting about these polarities, these three, is that every team should have both polarities on a team. That's how you have the most powerful teams. You want some people who have some fear of rejection. You want some people who are iconoclasts. You want some people who are patient. You want some people who are impatient. You want some people who are competitive. You want some people, because then the team supports, it balances, and when either polarity is required, the people who are higher on each can step up and take lead.
I feel like that's like my daughter falls into this, because the most common thing that I say to my wife is she doesn't care what we think.
Well, parents are different, my friend. I just have to say. Teenagers never care. Teenagers never care what their parents think.
All right. So maybe it's not that.
That's a bad gauge.
It's like every day. Why didn't she do that? Because she doesn't care what you said.
Right.
So we've got the 25 attributes. We've defined a number of terms here. We put it into context. Now we got to put it to use. There is an assessment tool on your website, theattributes.com. You can go there. You can gain an understanding of where you are. But there's also a need to define the core values, the things that you as a person care about. Why do you have to really start with the identification of your core values?
Well, I mean, you don't necessarily have to start there. The thing about values, though, is that our values, understanding what we value, can help point to our attributes. If we look at what shapes our behavior, our attributes begin to shape our values. Our values shape our beliefs, and our beliefs shape our behavior. Okay, or I guess we could add one thing. We could say feelings, right? Our beliefs shape our feelings, and our feelings shape our behavior. But ultimately, that's the order it goes in. So understanding our values helps to explore how and why we behave the way we do, but it also can point, in some cases, to some of the attributes. And that's why I have that values activity in there, because knowing both is just helpful. But again, attributes come first. We start with attributes. We begin to shape, our values begin to be shaped as we grow and experience, right? We're not born with values, okay? So those values begin to shape and grow, and then after that it comes. But those are both underneath, and the values exercise helps a little bit point to those attributes.
What about judgment versus understanding? What happens when I take the assessment and I look at it and I say, damn, I suck?
Oh, well.
Or I'm awesome. I'm amazing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, judgment is really an attempt to score something based on criteria laid out by someone else. And I would say it's laid out by you, but you're only judging it because you think you're kind of trying to anticipate what other people think. So it's hard to judge, and it's really not very empowering. And again, I think of our versus understanding as like, who am I? And so the way I describe this is that we are, as human beings, we're kind of like automobiles. We're kind of like cars, okay? Some of us, though, are Jeeps. Some of us are Ferraris. Some of us are SUVs. Kind of like that movie Cars, which I know you have kids. You've seen 1,000 times like I did. But we're all different, right? And now there's no judgment, because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But it behooves us to kind of lift our hood and figure out what we are, because we might be a Jeep that's been trying to run on a Ferrari track, or a Ferrari that's been trying to run on a Jeep track. And that might indicate why we feel some friction, why we feel some tension. And then we can make a very conscious decision. We can say either, you know what, I am a Jeep trying to run on a Ferrari track, and I want to continue being a Jeep running on a Ferrari track. So what do I need to work on to be better as a Jeep running on this Ferrari track? Or you say, you know what, now that I realize this, I don't want to be on a Ferrari track. I want to go find a Jeep track. And you can go find a Jeep track. But we can only do that through understanding. Judgment is about putting other people's beliefs and perceptions, or what we think, even worse, not even other people's, what we think other people's, you talk about false, right? What we think other people's perceptions or rules or beliefs are on something that we're engaging. There's really very little value in that, especially when we're in the process of self-discovery. So it's really more about understanding.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think now, what kind of car am I? I don't know, but I'm not a Tesla. That's the only thing that I won't be. I won't be a Tesla.
Yeah, I'm probably more of a Jeep, I would have to say. Yeah, so.
Skills and attributes can be learned, and they can be sharpened. And you identified a process in which a person can go about trying to refine this, right? They understand now. They identify that understanding. They understand their strengths. They see their weaknesses. And now it's, how do I improve? How do I get better? You've laid out an acronym START: slow down, think, act, recognize, try. Why START, And can we start with slow down and define these?
Yeah, I mean, the only way we can think about anything is to slow down first so that we may think about anything. I mean, the idea is if, and you know this, I mean, coming from the environment we both do, we know that the reason why spec operators are as effective as we are is we've trained ourselves to be able to slow our minds and calm ourselves so that we can consciously think about what's going on. Attributes, because they're happening in the background, because they just happen, right? Behooves us to kind of slow down for a moment and recognize what's happening. So we slow ourselves so that we can then think. And then once you think, you act, right? You say, okay, you're in an environment and things are changing around you outside your control. You're feeling uncomfortable. Okay, slow down. Why am I feeling uncomfortable? Okay, maybe it's because my adaptability is a little bit low. Now we act. We can deliberately say, okay, I am going to deliberately choose to behave and be more adaptable in this moment. I'm going to recognize how that feels, and then I'm going to try again and again to do it, to develop an attribute. So attribute development has to be self-motivated, self-directed, and then it takes a willingness for that person, that individual, to step deliberately into discomfort and uncertainty. So they may test and develop and tease that attribute, right? So if someone's impatient and they want to develop their patience, they have to deliberately go find environments inside of which they can test their patience and develop that, right? Whatever that looks like. It might be, hey, go deliberately drive in traffic or stand in the longest line at the grocery store. I always say have kids. That'll help develop your patience, right? But you have to do it. Yeah, you have to do it on your own. And the START acronym just helps kind of with a process way to think through that. Yeah.
For those who listen to the podcast, or the majority of them, they know that I love lists. So I appreciated the fact that towards the end of the book, there was a list, and I was like, yes, there's a list. I could throw that in there. So for all the listeners who love the lists and the process list, there you go. It's START. Rich, as we close out, the Jedburghs, they had to do 3 things every day as core foundational elements, core tasks that they had to be proficient in at the highest level in order to do their job. They had to be able to shoot. They had to be able to move. They had to be able to communicate. If they did these 3 things with precision, then their effort, their focus could be applied to the challenges that came their way. What are the 3 things that you do every day to be successful in your world?
Yeah, they're very basic. First thing I do is I hug my wife and kids every day. Second thing I do is I tell every one of them I love them multiple times a day. All right, those are the most important things to me. When I'm doing that on a daily basis, I am successful. It can actually be only those 2. And I think that stems from just being gone so much and being deployed so much and even losing so many friends too early. You just appreciate the people in your lives and you recognize, hey, we want to always make sure the people in our lives know that we love them and how we feel about them. So those are the first 2, but I won't dodge the question. I'll give you a third. And that third is...
Many have tried. No one has successfully achieved that.
The third is keep moving forward. I'm always in a position to say, okay, how can I move forward today? In some way, some capacity. It doesn't have to be big leaps. It can be steps. It can be gritty. It can be like tough. But if I take a step, if I can end the day saying, okay, I took a step forward, I feel great. And again, there's been days, not many of them, but where I end the day, I'm like, man, I didn't do anything today. I did nothing. And I feel horrible, right? I didn't take any steps. And it doesn't have to be work. I mean, maybe I go, clean the yard or do some sort of house task or something, but something that makes me feel like I'm taking a step. So those would be the 3 I'd hang on.
So we're starting 2022. We've closed the door on 2021. We've built this podcast, as I said, around these characteristics of elite performance. You, the Talent War Group, all of us have spoken so much about humility, understanding that others may know more than us, and then also a commitment to being better. And so I sit here and I think about, well, what's my New Year's resolution? And in a second, you're not going to get away from answering that question either, because you're going to give me yours. But I really took a lot from the book, and I mean that so sincerely, because it has opened the aperture in so many ways, and it's taken the 9 characteristics that we've talking about, and it's broken them down into these 25 attributes. It's layered that on. It's given us an opportunity to really start to understand what is human performance, what is this concept of optimal performance, and now how can we integrate that into the conversations that we have in 2022. And I said I was going to make a commitment in this episode to provide everybody a path to be better. And I would say that starts with myself. And so I thank you for the opportunity to start 2022 for me better than I ended 2021. And I know that will translate to all of our listeners. And I give that as a challenge to our listeners to take the principles and what we've spoken about here, read the book, and apply them in your everyday. At the end of these episodes, I almost always take one of our characteristics of performance and I apply it to the guest. And I say, this is the one thing that you exemplify. For the first time, I'm going to turn it on the guest and I'm not going to give you one. So I'm going to ask you two things. First, what is the one, if you could take one of your 25 and say, this really defines me. When I look at this one, I see me in the mirror. What would that be? And then also, as we start 2022, if you had one thing you got to work on, one thing you want to do better, what's it going to be?
The one thing that I have tried to make a habit in my life is courage. And again, courage is the ability to deliberately step into fear and discomfort. And it started with me choosing to be a Navy SEAL and everything we did in our careers, you as well, in yours. Everything about that career involved stepping into fear, sometimes on a daily, sometimes on an hourly, sometimes on a minute-by-minute basis. But then leaving the military, I really wanted to try something new. I wanted to write a book. I wanted to get in front of people and speak. And I wanted to do things that ultimately I was nervous to do. And so, but I truly believe for me, growth means I'm pushing these boundaries and I'm stepping out to these edges. And so that'd be one that I think I'm constantly always trying to exemplify is courage. The one I want to improve is not on the list. It's really just kind of a periphery, and that's self-discipline. I am committing to work on my self-discipline in 2022, because I think to have a balance of the two is really, really the most powerful combination. So that's what I'm going to work on.
See, and I was just going to say, so besides committing to going to Vegas and eating all the pastries and you took it from me, there you go. It's a self-discipline.
Right.
Rich, I really appreciate your time. This has been a phenomenal conversation. We've grown so much in our time together, and I've appreciated your partnership and your friendship over the last year as we've gotten involved with Talent War Group. We've watched that organization thrive and grow. We've been a part of them and partners. We've started this podcast now, going on, I think we're going to be in our 9th or 10th month here in January. So really exciting to come up on our 1-year anniversary. I thank you so much for everything that you've done for us, for our country, for leaders in general. Happy New Year, my friend. I wish you the best, and I know I'll be talking to you soon.
Well, thank you, friend. Happy New Year to you, and I appreciate our friendship. I look forward to all of our future conversations.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh Podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh Podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.